Hi, Lisa K. Donner here for Liberty Nation, and with me today is Legal Affairs Editor Scott Cosenza. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, Lisa.
All right, so the Supreme Court issued a ruling today, and it looks like the gun control lobby dodged a bullet. Tell us a little bit of the background.
Well, what the Supreme Court said today, Lisa, was that they will not hear a case that many gun rights advocates were hoping they would hear, and many gun controllers prayed they would not hear. It's the case of a New York City regulation that prevented gun owners who were legally able to own a gun in New York City from basically traveling anywhere with that gun.
All right, so this was kind of an interesting situation because the legislation sort of changed in the middle.
It sure did. The regulation itself was so I'm struggling for the right word, Lisa, because it was hard for many of us to believe that they thought it could pass constitutional muster. What the law said was that if you had a permit to own a gun in New York, and it is required that you own such a permit to have a gun, that you could only take that firearm to one of very few designated and approved ranges. So if you, for instance, had a house in South Carolina, you weren't legally able to take your own gun to your house in South Carolina in a car and then take it back. There was no provision for safe travel or anything. So many people thought, oh, this is a slam dunk, basically. The Supreme Court's going to knock this law back. And the gun rights people thought when they did knock it back, they might articulate a really good and broad standard for gun rights moving forward. Now that Donald Trump has had 2 additions to the Supreme Court, I think the thinking was that we'd get a robust, really, really good guns rights decision from the court.
Well, it's interesting. It was a situation where they just figured maybe we'll get away with it.
Well, yeah, and I think they did. So just to circle back to your original question, the authorities, both in New York City and in New York State, after the Supreme Court accepted this case, they ran to the legislature and they said, okay, we need a new law to take away the old law. That way the Supreme Court won't be able to rule on it whatsoever. And that's what they did. They passed a new law during the time this case was accepted to be heard at the Supreme Court, and now they passed new legislation. Then they went to the Supreme Court and said, well, we've got this new legislation, so don't even bother ruling on this law because it's not even the law anymore.
Well, still, Supreme Court Associate Justice Samuel Alito penned a blistering dissent, according to your article in Liberty Nation today.
It was, and it's one of these things, Lisa, where you try to sort of read the tea leaves. And Justice Alito wrote a pretty blistering dissent. He was joined by most of that dissent by Kavanaugh and Thomas, and by Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. And Justice Kavanaugh wrote separately to agree with the judgment, but he didn't want to be confused with any of the other justices who may agree with the judgment and also in an anti-Second Amendment way, because Justice Kavanaugh took time out of his decision to say he recognized that there's a sort of a logjam of anti-gun legislation that the court hasn't ruled on, and that he wants us to rule on it. That's what he's saying for his own sort of brother and sister justices, which leads me then to believe, Lisa, that perhaps it's Justice Roberts who is the stumbling block for having a good bright line rule on gun cases come out of this court.
But based on what you wrote, it sounded an awful lot like the Supreme Court justices are not pleased with the way states are applying the Heller decision.
Certainly that's true, Heller and McDonald. But what we have, Lisa, is not enough of them are so displeased in order to get those cases to be heard before the court. Remember, a number of justices have to agree before a case actually is heard before the Supreme Court. No case gets there sort of by right, with the exception of when one state sues another state.
All right, thank you very much. Legal Affairs Editor Scott D. Cosenza, thanks for joining us today. And thank you for tuning in to LibertyNation.com. Don't forget to check out our new Roku channel. Have a nice day.